For as long as men remember, the world's trade has been borne by sea. By sailing ships, linking peoples and countries bearing not cargoes of riches and collections of priceless antiques, but the basic commodities of life. They are the true historical reality of any age. Their archaeology is the mirror of everyday life.
The rugged coast of Devon has lured many a gallant ship to her doom. There's beauty and grandeur in these gnarled cliffs, but treachery too. Fast on the rocks in Hope Cove near Salcombe lies the Herzogin Cecily, largest and most famous of the few sailing vessels of today. 8 times the Finnish bark has won the grain race from Australia, but now her days are numbered. Aground from stem to stern she lies at the mercy of the sea. Look down on the beautiful ship, her mainmast 200 feet high, her 56,000 square feet of canvas furled for the last time, and grieve with her captain and her crew.
Trading ships driven by wind have now completely disappeared, but not their cargoes. This cargo from a wrecked Dutch East Indiaman of 1748 arrived in Europe 200 years late. When it was sold, it fetched prices that would have been unthought of in the 18th century, when it was just another consignment of Chinese tableware for the European market and sold by the crate. The great trading nations of the earth, like England and Holland, carried their flags across the sea to all parts of the globe. In the 18th century, the most famous company of all was the Dutch East India Company. They traded from Europe as far away as China. Everyday things like porcelain, mass-produced in the hills and shipped down to the warehouses of Canton. Tea, silks, spices, exotica from the Far East in return for silver from the West. Trading ships are basically ambassadors of nations, their armaments in past times more defensive than aggressive. Bulk carriers, not speedy, but carrying cargoes cheaply and efficiently. But they didn't just do this without ostentation. They were decorative and beautiful, reflecting something of the elegance and style of their age. In 1749, one of their vessels, the Amsterdam, ran aground on Hastings Beach. It was rediscovered in 1967 by local workmen laying a sewage pipe for the Hastings Borough Council. The foreman was well aware of the rumour that the Amsterdam lay somewhere nearby. When the tide was out, he began to dig. Within minutes, the teeth of the excavator dug into the wood of a ship's hull. The attention that the discovery attracted was typical of the attitudes to shipwrecks 20 years ago. The greatest prize were the cannon, and they were not to be seen together for long. They bore the marks of the Dutch East India Company, their original rightful owners. There was enough furore about this unconventional archaeology to attract the conventional archaeologists. The Amsterdam surfaces ghost-like on the low spring tides every quarter year. For a few precious hours, the outline is visible and the ship accessible. The archaeologists begin work. Land archaeology on these half-submerged mudflats is hard work, crude and makeshift, even when you are professional. The same night, the next low tide gives another opportunity for work. But the faster the sea goes out, the faster it comes back in. But with some of the mud cleared, there is evidence here of a substantial trading ship. Not just the usual few timbers, but revealed under the lights a whole ship's side, some 30 feet deep, buried under the mud. But here, under these conditions, controlled excavation is totally impossible. Within 4 hours, the tide reclaims the Amsterdam, one of the few intact examples of an 18th century East Indiaman to survive anywhere in the world. Since 1969, marine archaeology has developed enormously. The Amsterdam has not moved, but techniques have. And 1984 saw the start of a new venture, an excavation working not this time when the tide was out, but when it was in. A specially constructed cofferdam encloses the far end of the wreck and acts partly as a sea break and partly as the working platform for what is now a diving operation, and a cooperative venture by two nations, Britain and Holland. The Dutch director of the excavations is Jerzy Gawronski.
All the first shifts will work on the starboard side. That means that all the airless has to be brought over. They're all laying on the port side now. So that's Adrian, Colin, Sarah, Dick and Ippe. According to circumstances, we will decide between the third and the fourth shift to have a window. And it means a non-airlift period in which all the divers are out of the water and the airlifts are out of use. So John will be able to have good visibility to do a video run of some points of the ship and the wreck. Because if this weather breaks, it will be the last chance to have decent visibility.
Weather alone permitting, the season can be infinite. The power and communications, high-pressure air and video control are shore-based. Only the divers need to be taken out to sight. For the next 3 months, the operation will continue from this steel tower sitting out at sea, a tower capable of operation at all states of the tide.
Right.
The English director is John Adams, former assistant director of the excavation of the Mary Rose. Unlike most archaeological operations which use conventional cylinders and wetsuits, the Amsterdam team use full-scale commercial, industrial diving equipment.
Okay, John, comms check. How do you hear me?
Loud and clear, Adrian. How many?
Loud and clear, also. Stand by for bailout check.
Roger.
Let's say now.
Bailout closed. Okay.
But when the Amsterdam became an underwater excavation, rather than a dry land or welly boot dig, it was a necessary transition in the sense that the productivity we needed, the amount of work we needed to get done, meant we had to be able to work on it all day for months at a time. In the dry land situation, you were having to get down to the wreck for a few hours a day, for 2 or 3 days at a time, but four times a year. And in those situations, you were actually having to dig a large hole very, very quickly. And it's very difficult to actually see what's going on. Now, underwater, surprisingly, the more water you have over the site, the easier it is to work on the actual ship.
The Amsterdam lies under 20 feet of water, and even this is a fairly murky 20 feet. But nonetheless, the timbers are accessible, easy to work around, and to record.
John? How are you doing and whereabouts are you?
I've just done a shot with a beam, so I'm going to let the visibility clear, get out the hole for a bit. I'm just going to go and check Jersey's area and make sure he's aware of my presence.
An underwater video improves the ability to monitor the work and sees better than the human eye. And what's it revealing?
We have fairly major constructional differences showing up between what has been learnt from a very detailed model and the actual reality in which the structural elements of the ship have been put together. These are working drawings from a model that was almost rediscovered, if you like, in Amsterdam last year, which, if not of the actual ship, is certainly of that particular class of ships. I'm dealing in particular with an elevation of the inboard structure on the port side, concentrating on the lower gun deck and the upper gun deck. And here we have a very good example of the sort of differences that the reality gives you from the best possible guess, if you like, from the contemporary archives. You might be forgiven for thinking that, looking at drawings like this, that there was no necessity to survey the remains of the actual ship, because there wouldn't be much more information you could learn. These drawings look so final and so perfect that we would know everything about the ship. However, the survey that we're conducting at the moment, on the inboard structure in particular, shows very dramatic differences in the disposition of the main structural elements. And it shows that even in the middle of the 18th century, that when it got beyond the drawing board, the specifications laid down by the East India Company designers to the shipyard, the shipwright could at the last moment obviously decide that he didn't want to put a knee up under the deck beams, he'd rather have it against a transom lower down, because he felt obviously that it would do a better job there. Similarly, we're finding things, especially on the outside of the ship, which are so like the model it's uncanny. So you get both extremes. You get confirmation of the design details being followed, but major structural differences at the same time. Contrary to popular belief, in many shipwrecks, even those that have been badly smashed up, the material that is found by the archaeologists within the hull is not just a random scatter. And by surveying in exactly where the material is, you can actually work back and establish where it was originally in the ship, how it was designed, how it was put together, and in some cases who owned it.
The most advanced method of survey yet devised is used on this site. Direct survey measurement is the system which can cope with all combinations of tide, visibility, and the ability of any diver. A way of fixing every object in time and space at the moment of discovery.
If there's any problem with the datum points, it'll either tell you that it either doesn't recognise the name of the datum point, or that it hasn't got the coordinates for the datum. Right. In which case you have to supply them later. But that's okay. It knows where all those datum points are in 3 dimensions, so now it's ready for you to give it some of the objects you surveyed.
The computer is another set of eyes with a permanent memory bank and the ability to recall information at any time.
1.635. Okay, bottle 21. End of file, right, that's it, done. So you've got all your coordinates? Yeah. So in fact we might as well print that.
Trading ships usually carry the very ordinary things of life, as well as the exotica. Bits and pieces that often go unnoticed. Bottles. Sections of rope. Even handfuls of pins. The bottles are often corked and full of wine. 3 objects, bottle, cork and contents, for the price of 1.
Now. Coming in.
Each of them yielding vital pieces of information, all just as they were on Sunday the 26th of January, 1749, the date they were lost. Their customers now are the conservators. Lifting objects from sea to air can be difficult. This coil of rope, for example, must be lifted so that its separate fibres don't disintegrate as it comes through the waters.
Yeah, whoa! The rope is already broken there.
All right. If the boat windy.
This is where the planning of the Amsterdam operation is comprehensive. A conservation service, not only just on the platform and in the boat, but ready waiting on the shore. A local ballroom in a holiday camp is now a conservation area, the domain of archaeologist Peter Marsden.
Oh, nice with the marbles, gaming marbles here. I think they are. That's part of a set, gaming set.
Conservationists have to be able to cope with every possible substance. Like this, for instance. A drinking glass wrapped in its original packing. Both packing and glass completely undamaged. Until fully conserved, this material is incredibly fragile. It has to be sprayed constantly with water whilst it's photographed to prevent it from drying out, flaking or disintegrating. Immediate photography is an integral part of the recording process.
So we'll treat the bottle as object number 1 of the group, then the cork as object number 2,
Yes.
and the contents as object number 3.
Ownership.
Ownership VOC.
One of the special features of the Amsterdam excavation is that the surviving historical records indicate what this material cost at the time, where it was going, what it was worth, and in the case of personal objects, who they belonged to.
One of the most important aspects of the Amsterdam is that it is an extraordinary combination of archaeological record and historical record. And these two things together give us a picture of life in the past, which you cannot normally get from the historical records alone or from archaeological remains alone. And in one way, this comes together particularly well with this object, which to me is I think the most exciting thing that we've found. It's the lid of a box with the initials WK carved on it. And there was only one person on board with those initials, and this is clearly the lid of one of the chests belonging to Willem Klump, the captain of the ship. And in the paybook of the ship, which these are copies, we find down here Willem Klump of Mittau, Captain Lieutenant, 5 kelders, 5 wine boxes, and no chests. So no chests of personal possessions, but there are 5 wine boxes. And this is the lid. It's too small to be a personal chest anyway. And this is clearly one of these objects which are documented. Well, this had fallen from the captain's cabin outside the ship and had been caught round by the stern post under the curving counter of the ship. So here we have the two things coming together. Many of the other objects in the ship can be related to a limited number of people, and so in this way we're able to build up a picture of the community in a way which one cannot get from documentary records alone or purely from the archaeological artifacts alone.
This piece of a lady's quilted dress still has the pins in position. At the time of the tragedy, the owner, Petronella Skauk, was working on it. Her handiwork has survived. Even delicate things, like this flower from a hatband, have been preserved in the mud, as if it was only yesterday.
I mean, with most excavations, you actually haven't got that much material left. With Amsterdam, we have 2/3 of a ship full of cargo, personal belongings. And you also, in the VOC, have one of the best documented maritime enterprises ever. Now you put the two together and you have an unparalleled opportunity to get a very, very detailed insight into that period in Dutch history.
But some details are unexpected, like the artistry on the stern end of the ship discovered in the last days of the excavation. The intricate carving and the foliate details of a mermaid's tail. The Amsterdam was decorated and ornamented to the highest standards of the Dutch East India Company. The rest of the ship is still in place, in a remarkable state of preservation, and still waiting to be uncovered. It will take many years of excavation before the picture can be completed. It will take money, time, and it will always be at the mercy of the tides and the
By the Meteorological Office at 2343 on Tuesday the 13th of November 1984. There are warnings of gales in Viking, North Ustira, South Ustira, Fortis, Cromarty, Forth, Tyne, Dogger, Fisher, White, Portland, Plymouth, Biscay, Trafalgar, Finisterre, Seoul, London, Barnhead, Irish Sea, Shannon, Manning, Texas, Navy.
This is St. Peter Port, Guernsey, and working right in the harbour entrance is the tiny diving vessel of the Guernsey Maritime Trust. The conditions are extremely hazardous as the huge ferries bear down on her. Underneath the ship lies a Roman ship.
This diving vessel, all clear, and all clear for you to enter.
Roger, all received. Very many thanks.
She lies in the entrance to the harbour, and she's very much subjected to the prop wash from every large vessel that goes in and out. It's that prop wash which exposed her in the first place.
Hard to starboard, hard to starboard.
Stern's going south.
Yeah, we know all about that now. See the mud coming up yesterday?
I'm convinced that the tops of the timbers were the seabed level prior to 1982, and now she's been systematically washed apart. There's no real strength in the fastenings of the hull, and she's been torn to pieces. In some cases, the timbers are simply lifting off and moving, but in other instances, the timbers have been torn in half, just like a torn stick of rhubarb. And I dived on the site 2.5 months ago, and it was very, very clear that we had no time at all. Something had to be done to remove those loose timbers and survey the structure before it broke up.
Unlike the work on the Amsterdam, this site had to be worked as a rescue operation, and with little backup to recover what were originally rather unpromising looking timbers. Such a ship in such a place was unheard of. The Romans, trading between Celtic Gaul and Britain, were not known to frequent Guernsey. So was this ship, lying buried under a cargo of molten pitch, in fact Roman or Celtic? Only archaeology would determine. Breaking up solidified pitch underwater is not an easy job, but it has to be done with care and consideration in order to preserve any object that might be trapped within it, like a Roman tile.
Right, I think we'll get the divers up. Time's come. Now boat.
Very good.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
As well as the usual dangers of diving in near freezing waters, the divers are constantly hindered by the continual passage of the mail boats and ferries.
Doesn't look too bad.
It's over time now, it's 9:15. We must be out the way.
That's all clear. Thank you.
Under this grid is the outline of what is actually a Celtic vessel, heavily built, very closely framed, and difficult to interpret until it's carefully measured and drawn. John Adams, fresh from the Amsterdam, was involved in its mapping and recording. By November, there's more darkness than daylight.
Diver in,
Get straight to the other end.
Yes.
Adrian will have cleaned that up.
Absolutely,
I'll carry
yes.
on
They're the
with
two, because they seem to be different. And if they're different, we've got to think about why. Yes.
Okay.
Fine. Oh, good luck. Cheers. Okay. Diver down, John Adams.
For 14 days and nights, the team continued with one of the most difficult underwater archaeological rescue operations ever done in the British Isles. But good professional divers can work even in the dark. On this site, as it was so close to the shore, mains lights could be supplied from the harbour pilot house, sufficient light to find the smallest of objects, like this Roman coin of 125 AD, which gives a likely date for the loss of the ship. To lift the timbers is a problem. But it's a problem that's solved by removing the body of a commercial lorry and winching the body into the sea in order to load the 2,000-year-old timbers from the seabed.
Can you get gear on?
This ship was sturdily built. The planks are of oak, 2 feet thick, and considerable effort is required to move them around. The men who built this ship built it to do a job, and they built it to last. Even in the 2nd century AD, they were in the heavy transport business. In 2 very short seasons, 95% of what could be recovered of the timbers of this very rare ship came to shore. The archaeologists have now embarked on a lengthy process of conservation and recording, but quite a lot has been learnt already. And one of the important and unexpected finds, though least spectacular, is this small piece of rope trapped in the pitch. It's called a kringle. Proof that this was in fact a sailing ship. A Celtic trading ship with a cargo of pitch that caught fire and sank in Guernsey harbour. This is no speculative image. These plans confirm for the first time the accuracy of the account of just such a vessel, actually seen and described by Julius Caesar.
Ships made entirely from oak for strength and resistance to damage. Cross timbers fixed to 1 foot deep whales by iron nails as thick as a man's thumb. Anchors secured by iron chains instead of ropes. Skins and thinly prepared leather instead of sailcloth. Either due to weakness of their linen and ignorance of its use for the purpose, or, as is more probable, because they thought that the great storms and high winds of the Atlantic could not satisfactorily be withstood, nor ships of such great weight be driven by sails of cloth.
Caesar was right, and he was familiar with storms, as was Shakespeare. I boarded the king's ship, now on the beak, now in the waist, the deck. In every cabin I flamed amazement. The fire and cracks of sulphurous roaring, the most mighty Neptune seemed to besiege, and make his bold waves tremble, yea, his dread trident shake. That description is from The Tempest. It was based on an account of the same storm by Sir George Somers, the master of the Sea Venture.
We were within 7 or 8 days of Cape Henry, when most unusually a dreadful storm and hideous began to blow out the northeast, swelling and roaring as it were by fits, and at length did beat all the light from heaven, which like an hell of darkness turned black upon us. 6 and sometimes 8 men were not enough to hold the whipstaff, by which may be imagined the strength of the storm in which the sea swelled above the clouds and gave battle unto heaven. It could not be said to rain. The waters like whole rivers did flood in the air.
It was the year 1609, and the master of the Sea Venture found himself cast away on a terrifying island.
We found it to be the dangerous and dreaded islands, which were so terrible to all that ever touched on them, and such tempests, thunders, and other fearful objects we seen and heard about them, that they be called commonly the Devil's Islands.
But the survivors' fears soon turned out to be groundless.
Yet it pleased our merciful God to make even this hideous and hated place both the place of our safety and means of our deliverance. Yet did we find the air temperate, and the country abundantly fruitful of all necessaries for the sustentation and preservation of man's life. There is fowl in great number upon the islands where they breed, the bird being of the bigness of a good pigeon, and layeth eggs as big as hen's eggs upon the sand. And there is a tree called a palmetto tree, which hath a very sweet berry upon which the hogs do most feed. But our men, finding the sweetness of them, did willingly share with the hogs for them, they being very pleasant and wholesome. Wherefore my opinion sincerely of this island is that, whereas it hath been and is still accounted the most dangerous, infortunate, and most forlorn place of the world, it is in truth the richest, healthfulest, and pleasing land, and merely natural, as ever man set foot upon.
The Island of Devils, beautifully described by an ordinary Elizabethan trading sea captain, was in fact one of the islands of Bermuda. today it is difficult enough to navigate here into the harbour of St. George's. Travelling as passengers on the Sea Venture were Sir Thomas Gates, the governor of the new colony of Virginia in America, and his deputy. They weren't satisfied with the paradise they'd found, but looked for deliverance. And out of the wreckage of the old Sea Venture, they created that deliverance. They built from the scattered timbers a much smaller vessel, commemorated here by a replica. Bermuda became a colony because ships of trade often bore colonists, true merchant adventurers. But the passengers on the Deliverance were keen to reach that other colony, just founded at Jamestown, Virginia. It is another tribute to the captain's ability to navigate that despite being blown hundreds of miles off course, they arrived within weeks in the James River. But not all of the colonists liked what they saw. Many of them preferred to return to the island of Devils, to Bermuda, where Deliverance today is remembered not only in the name of the local ferry, but by some of the local inhabitants, and especially by one man, Edmund Downing, a direct descendant of the captain of soldiery on the Sea Venture itself.
It was 1958, and I bought this boat about 2 years before, and had gotten it all fixed up with air compressor and metal detector, and had 6 glass windows in the bottom. And so it was an ideal boat for wreck hunting. So not having any special wreck to work on right then, I decided to look for the Sea Venture. About May 1958, I started looking for it. And we'd go down to St. George's and just go back and forth and look through these windows, and as a sort of a grid pattern, until we finally recovered the entire area between the channel and the shore. And then we decided to make one last trip, and so we went down to Sea Venture Flat. We decided we'd look across the channel. So we went out in the ocean and tried to duplicate the course of the original Sea Venture. And we went right up Sea Venture Flat, and we came to this cut in the coral, in the reef. So I said, this looks exactly like the old descriptions of where the wreck was. So we started up the air compressor, and I dropped down in this cut, and I could see these ballast rocks. And I just followed this trail of ballast rocks, and I came to this enormous wreck.
But nobody believed him until recently, when a new expedition was started. The Sea Venture Trust consists of a small group of people working with limited resources, but great determination. And one of the most determined is the man whose brainchild the trust was. Former commercial diver with over 50 years' experience of diving in the most hazardous and arduous conditions imaginable. He is a man of great determination. Smokey Wingwood.
Put the artifact in the bag, right, with a tag, give me the DSM position. Okay. Then seal the whole thing up, and you got all the record in one go.
He retired when he was 54. He really would have liked something, a nice hobby, and the Maritime Museum was founded just after that. And then they started to open the file on the Sea Venture. And he thought, well, this is a wonderful way to spend my retirement. And I would like to be the man that confirms that this really is the Sea Venture. And this started 10 years of research, photography, traveling, reading, collecting,
Many other changes and sacrifices too, of a less attractive nature. Not many people would transform the basement of their own home into a conservation laboratory. Not many would recruit and support volunteers from many disciplines to work unpaid on a project with no official funding. But the care and conservation of artifacts from the sea is any excavation's first priority. The Wingoods have done just that.
The Sea Venture has never been investigated, or hadn't been up to this time, investigated archaeologically, which is the only proper way to do it. We could go out and pillage the thing and destroy the evidence forever, but it seemed the logical way to go. We've been working on it since 1978, and the finding of the Bellarmine was pure accident. I was on my way up without air, and I happened to see this bump on the bottom, which wasn't natural. I went down and just fanned the silt off the top of it, and lo and behold, there was this beautiful Bellarmine. It was quite a moment, I can tell you.
Bellarmines are one of the most common forms of European jug. Nearly every merchant ship for 200 or 300 years from the 16th century onwards carried them. They are the trademark of the North European trader.
Okay.
Well, I think the Sea Venture has demonstrated that on a ship that is not a treasure vessel, it's a merchant ship taking people to the colonies, a very, very high standard of work can be achieved, and it can be conducted over a long period of time. The amount of post-excavation research being done on it is quite considerable. It doesn't have to be done quickly, and it doesn't have to take a lot of money at once.
This has now become one of the most disciplined and well-formulated small excavations. The remaining structure is covered and uncovered every season. It's monitored, controlled, and recorded. And because it's done at leisure, micro water jets can be used to operate with infinite precision in the smallest of areas. The hull that has survived both the storm and the construction of the Deliverance is historically very important. It's one of the earliest known English working ships and evidence of the actual structure of ships that fought the Armada. But what proves that it is English and the Sea Venture? Evidence comes from some of the least spectacular finds. This pottery is cheap, ordinary ware from Barnstaple in Devon. But despite its unprepossessing appearance, this was actual proof that the wreck was Sea Venture. And even more significantly, it could be closely related to its original destination, colonial America. Those newly founded colonies on the James River in Virginia did not all survive. From evidence by excavation, the lost town at Wolstenholme has recently been resurrected. The archaeology of colonial America has been the speciality of Ivor Noel Hume.
The kind of archaeology that I do, historical archaeology, or in Britain post-medieval archaeology, wears a straitjacket of historical exactitude. By that I mean that to contribute to written history we have to be precise. In prehistory, if we're off by 200 or 300 years, nobody's going to shoot us. But when we're dealing with our 18th and 19th centuries and 17th centuries of our own millennium, we need to be able to say, this is the way it was about our sites at a given moment, like 1622, March, Friday in the morning. And that, in fact, is when the town of Wolstenholme Town was destroyed in the Great Indian Uprising of March 22nd, 1622. Now, very rarely can you date a land site that precisely, but with shipwrecks, you can. And so if you know from a document that a ship went down at a given date, at a given location, and you go there and you find it, the result is a perfectly dated time capsule. And the things that you find on it were either in use or in transit at the moment that the water rushed in. So if you've got a shipwreck site of 1619, and you find things on it which match what we found on our site of 1622, that's confirming corroborative evidence. If, on the other hand, you find a shipwreck of 1640, and there are things on that that are found on our alleged site of 1622, then we have a problem. So you see, it's a question of underwater archaeology and land archaeology cross-fertilizing. We enrich each other. This is a West of England storage jar, which comes from our Wolstenholme Town site, and therefore we are happy that it dates prior to 1622. Similar jars to this were found aboard the Sea Venture, but when they were first found, nobody was quite sure that it was the Sea Venture, and so a whole suitcase of fragments of these things were brought to me, asked me, could this be the Sea Venture period? Well, we couldn't specifically say that, but we could say, well, yeah, these kinds of jars, this jar, which matches yours, dates prior to 1622. And that was a whole lot better than had been possible to do before, because up to that point, although these kinds of jars have been found fairly frequently in southwest England, they hadn't been found in close archaeological context, and the best one could say on them, well, they're 17th century, maybe mid-17th century, and that wasn't good enough for the Sea Venture people. So here was a case where an object that we had found really helped them. And that wasn't the only one. There was a rather extraordinary object that we'd excavated, this iron basket-like thing. It's the basket hilt from what used to be called an Irish sword. And we now know that these are very common in England. A hilt like this was found aboard the Sea Venture. And this helped military historians because they had no evidence really how early these things went, no physical evidence that is, although there are some paintings. And from the Sea Venture came this hilt, which we have drawn from its very encrusted remains, and that hilt is of the same type as this.
The archaeology of trade is all about familiar objects in unfamiliar places. The commonplace and unrecorded items of everyday life, perhaps. The possessions of merchants and sailors scattered miles from their homelands, borne by ships of no renown. Yet they tell stories that inspired authors, founded new societies, mixed peoples and cultures, and were then forgotten. In bringing these stories back to life, marine archaeology is truly digging up people.